good evening. Welcome back to Dusty Feet. It's July 21st, 2026, and we're continuing our Outside the Class series as we walk through this scroll of First Kings. Tonight, it's our part 14, and we come to chapters 15 and 16. Now, these chapters, they move quickly. Kings rise, kings die, dynasties are established, and then they're erased. One king rules for decades, and another, he manages only 7 days. But beneath all those names, the narrator keeps returning to one central question. Which direction is the king heading? And, I guess in that, is he moving Israel toward Yahweh? Or is he just continuing the patterns of idolatry, fear, violence, self-protection that have already taken root very deeply? Because a throne can change hands without a kingdom truly changing direction. So be sure to go and read 1 Kings chapter 15 and 16. There's even more to the story. And it provides the fuller context of the conversation that we're about to talk about. So let's sit back, relax, wander Dusty Feet path through 1 Kings chapters 15 and 16. Our hope with the Dusty Feet is to foster discussion and to help build and support communities. If you're not already connected to a community or just want to share and interact, this community has 4 primary ways to interact. 1. DustyFeet.com. That's our primary place for everything. You are always free to comment. 2. Substack. Link is in the description below. Designed around the written and spoken text, it's a place to connect to ourselves and others. 3. Facebook at Dusty Feet Journey. These videos and other videos are also available for comment and discussion. And as always, 4. You're welcome to send an email to Bob at TheDustyFeet.com. These places, they will be moderated and guidelines will be set to ensure healthy, safe discussion. And of course, before we jump in, quick reminder, if you do find these discussions useful, please click that subscribe. And if you think someone else might enjoy exploring the scriptures that we do too, that's when you hit the like button, because that really does help more people discover this series. Because along this road, we're going to be asking a lot of questions. There are questions about the text, its context and history, about people, choices, patterns, meaning. The answers? We'll see where the dusty path leads. So chapter 15, it begins in the southern kingdom of Judah with Abijam, the son of Rehoboam. He becomes king while Jeroboam is still ruling in the north, and the evaluation of his reign, well, let's just say it's not encouraging. The text says that Abijam walked in the sins his father had committed before him, and that his heart was not wholly devoted to Yahweh. That phrase, his heart was not wholly, okay? That takes us back to Solomon, right? Because Solomon's divided heart, right? That divided heart eventually produced what? A divided kingdom. And now those rulers who follow him are being measured by that very same question of allegiance, right? It's not, was the king intelligent? Was the king politically savvy and or successful? Did he win battles? But here's the question. Was his heart directed towards Yahweh? Abijam, he fell short. Yet the narrator immediately tells us that for David's sake, Yahweh gives him a lamp in Jerusalem by raising up a son after him. Right? A lamp is a small, but I think is a very powerful picture, because the light, well, it hasn't gone out, right? The line of David continues, and not because every descendant is faithful. It's because Yahweh remains faithful and committed to his promises. Because for sure, that does not excuse the failure of any future kings. And maybe we need to realize that maybe not all lamps or lights are good, right? They show what they show. I think they just light up the holder of that lamp. But that simply reminds us for sure that the biblical stories is being held together by more than human faithfulness and human unfaithfulness. Because if it depended entirely on kings, right, or us for that matter, with our mirrors in hand, if it's up to them or us getting everything right, I think the story would be already over. But after Abijam dies, his son Asa, he becomes king of Judah. And this is when the story does give us a change of tone, right? Asa does what is right in the eyes of Yahweh. He removes the cult prostitutes from the land. He gets rid of idols that his ancestors had. He even removes Makkah, right? This is his own grandmother from her position as queen mother. Why? Because she made a detestable image for the Asherah. Now, to be fair, that last decision couldn't have been easy, because it's one thing to condemn idolatry from a distance. It's very much another thing to confront it within your own family, and even then, within the royal household. Asa does not allow family influence or tradition that he had inherited to make these idols untouchable. He tears it down. He burns it, right? This feels like this is genuine reform. He's not simply making a speech about change. He is removing something that had been placed in a protected place. But as we continue, right? Asa's story is not perfectly tidy, right? Those high places though, they're not removed. And when Baasha, right, the king of Israel, right, this is who taken over, he begins fortifying Ramah, that's near Judah's border. And Asa responds by taking silver and gold from the treasuries of the temple and from the palace. And then he sends him to Ben-Hadad, right, the king of Aram. And he pays him, what? To break his alliance with Baasha. Strategy works. Ben-Hadad, he attacked Israel, and Baasha abandons Ramah. So, politically, Asa gets the result he wants. But the scene leaves us with a question. Was this wise diplomacy? Was it a wise use of temple resources? Or did fear lead Asa to place too much confidence in this foreign king and maybe his shrewd investment? And First Kings doesn't spend much time really interpreting that choice. Although Chronicles, when we get there, will look at this a bit more critically. But here, we get to hear the story. How do we choose to take it? How do we choose to respond? I love these questions. So perhaps the point for us is that Asa can be genuinely devoted to Yahweh, right? And yet still make imperfect decisions under pressure. Being faithful does not mean flawless, right? Because the text says his heart was fully committed to Yahweh. And even then, in our stories, this is allowing us to see places where his trust, well, it may have wavered. But that is more realistic, truthfully, isn't it? It's more realistic than just dividing every person into an uncomplicated hero or an uncomplicated villain, as in all bad or all good. And sometimes the direction of a life is faithful, even while during that time frame. Individual choices, they might need some correction. And then the story moves north. It moves north to Israel, and the pace begins to accelerate. Um, Nadab, this is the son of Jeroboam, he becomes king. And he reigns 2 years. And then the narrator tells us that he walks in the ways of his father and he continues the sin by which Jeroboam caused Israel to sin. And that phrase, it will appear repeatedly throughout the story of this northern kingdom. The, the sin of Jeroboam. I'd like to have a sin or a pattern tied to your name. That would be tough. But Jeroboam had feared, his drive was he feared losing the loyalty of his people. Because if they continued to travel to Jerusalem to worship, they'd walk away. So remember, he created this alternate worship center at Bethel and Dan. He had installed golden calves, appointed his own priests, established his own festival. So what had began as one king's attempt to protect his position, it had now become what we could say is an inherited national system. And Nadab does not prevent the problem. He just continues it. And I think that might be one of the more unsettling ideas in these chapters. What one generation introduces, right, then that next generation, it just may accept that as normal. Because eventually people will just stop asking why that exists. They inherit it, they maintain it, and then they pass it on. That Nadab's end, his reign, it ends when Baasha conspires against him and kills him. Baasha then destroys the entire house of Jeroboam, all of them. And then we see that that's fulfilling, right? Fulfills the word spoken by the prophet Isaiah. But here's the strange part. We know that God's word is true. But Baasha removes Jeroboam's family, and yet he continues in Jeroboam's sin. He changes the dynasty. He is the instrument that answers God's promise. And then the dynasty has changed, but the direction hasn't. God's promises, they will happen. His will be done. But the choices of those that follow, well, they still need to do their parts. He replaces the people in power without changing the values guiding that power. That's what Baasha does. So that deeper problem, it still remains. It's still there. And I think that seems worth remembering, right? Whenever we assume that changing leaders will automatically change a community, sometimes it does. But sometimes the name on the door changes, but the same patterns, they're just going to continue inside. So Yahweh, he sends the prophet Jehu, the son of Hanani, right? He sends him with a message for Baasha. Yahweh says that he raised Baasha from the dust and made him leader over Israel. Baasha did not create his own opportunity. He was given a position. He was given responsibility. But instead of choosing to walk faithfully, he followed the path of Jeroboam. God gave him the opportunity. He had the choices. So the same judgment pronounced against Jeroboam's house, well, it's now pronounced against Baasha's. Baasha had become the instrument through whom judgment came on Jeroboam. But carrying out judgment on someone does not make Baasha righteous. He still had choices. He opposed Jeroboam, and yet at the same time, continued to imitate him. And that's a subtle warning, but it, I think, is very important. Because it's possible to recognize what's wrong in another person, and yet still carry the same pattern in ourselves. I think that goes with that log spike thing, that log toothpick thing. Think about it. Because with our mirrors in hand, that caution, that really should humble us. Because we may reject a name, something, a people, a person, a leader, whatever, their personality, their leadership, but we end up repeating the same behavior that we've condemned. And the prophets, they keep bringing the story back to this underlying issue. Because it's not just who's king, right? The real question is always, whom does the king serve? Baasha dies. His son Elha becomes king. His reign lasts only 2 years. Because while Elha is drinking himself drunk in the home of one of his officials, there's a military commander, Zimri, right? He conspires against him, kills him. Zimri then destroys the entire house of Baasha. Another dynasty disappears. Another prophetic word is filled, right? But Zimri, his success, it only lasts a few days. Because when the army hears what's happened, they proclaim their commander Omri as king. So Omri marches against Tisra. He marches into the capital. Zimri sees the city's fallen. He goes to the royal palace, sets himself on fire, and dies. His reign, 7 days. That short reign says almost everything without needing much explanation. It just does. Zimri kills for the throne. He destroys a royal house. And for a moment, he possesses the palace. And then it's gone. Maybe power gained through violence proves unable to provide any real security. Something to chew on. But the Northern Kingdom is beginning to consume itself, right? Each successful conspiracy teaches the next ambitious person that maybe assassination is a possible path to that throne. Violence does not end instability, right? It multiplies it. Because after Zimri's death, the nation splits itself. So we have a split nation, and then we have a split nation inside a nation. Because the supporters of Omri and the supporters of another man named Tibni, they're at it. Eventually, Omri's faction prevails. Omri becomes king over all of Israel. So, from the standpoint of political history, Omri then appears to have then become a significant ruler. He purchases a hill, builds a new capital there. This name is important, Samaria, right? That city is going to remain important throughout the rest of Israel's story. This is made. We're not going to forget it. But Omri's dynasty was well known beyond Israel. It had gotten out across the borders. The foreign records that we have from outside would remember his house. But the biblical narrator is not especially impressed by Omri's political resume. Because the text says Omri did evil in the sight of Yahweh, and he acted more wickedly than all who were before him. That reputation that was outside the land, it wasn't the light to the nations that God wanted. And that contrast is deliberate. A king can be important in the eyes of those surrounding nations, and he can still be judged unfaithful within the biblical story. Because he can build a capital. He can strengthen the government. He can establish a name that survives outside the land, that it gets put in foreign records, right? But the first scroll of Kings evaluates success very, very differently. What did he do with the people entrusted to him? Who did his leadership encourage them to worship? What did he, his household, and his leaders, where did it point? Did the kingdom become more faithful and just? Was it more aligned with God? Because in Omri's case, the answer is no, right? That doesn't mean that his political skill was meaningless. I mean, it means political achievement cannot substitute for covenant faithfulness. But a healthier kingdom is not necessarily a stronger kingdom. Omri dies, and his son Ahab becomes king. And with Ahab, well, the northern kingdom enters into an even darker stage, right? The narrator says Ahab does more evil in the eyes of Yahweh than any king before him. He continues the sins of Jeroboam, but then he goes further. We're going to hear another name that shows up. He marries Jezebel, right? The daughter of Ethbaal. He's the king of the Sidonians. And he begins serving and worshiping Baal, right? He builds a temple. He builds an altar for Baal in Samaria. He makes an Asherah pole. Jeroboam, way back, had created a distorted form of Israelite worship to protect his throne. And now, Ahab, he now gives official royal support, following in that line, to Baal worship. The compromise is just deepened. Jeroboam's actions may have been presented as a practical adjustment, right? You don't need to travel all the way to Jerusalem. But several generations later, Israel's not, it's no longer merely worshiping Yahweh. They should be. And they're doing it in a distorted way. Because its king is openly promoting another god. This is how drift works. Because that first step with Jeroboam, it just may appear small, even manageable. But the next generation grows accustomed to it. The next step's taken. And eventually the community finds itself far from where it began. And so by the end of chapter 16, Baal worship has royal sponsorship. Ahab's become the most openly rebellious king Israel has yet seen. But that also prepares us for what comes next. Because the rise of Ahab and Jezebel will be met by the appearance of Elijah. Because now the stage is being set for a confrontation over a basic question. It's a good one. Who truly gives rain, life, and fertility to the land? Is it Baal or is it Yahweh? So the chapter closes with this brief but troubling story about Hiel of Bethel, who rebuilds Jericho. Long before, remember, we read about this, Joshua had pronounced a curse against rebuilding the city. It's back in Joshua 6:26. At the time Joshua invoked this curse, may the curse of the Lord fall upon anyone who tries to rebuild the town of Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundation. At the cost of his youngest son, it will set up his gates. So 1 Kings tells us that Hiel, he laid its foundation at the cost of his firstborn son. He set up his gates at the cost of his youngest. The old warning? It had been forgotten. As a minimum, ignored. And I think perhaps that detail belongs here. It belongs here because Israel is losing more than faithful worship, right? It's losing its covenant memory. The people are no longer seem to be shaped by the stories that formed them. Because Jericho should have reminded Israel of Yahweh's power and of the beginning of their life in the land. That story should have reminded them. But instead, it just becomes another place where an old world is treated lightly, and in his case, with devastating consequences. A people can become so focused on the present that it forgets what roads have already been marked as dangerous. I think we're in that same time today. And that forgetfulness, that just leaves the next generation to rediscover those consequences. We don't pass on the story has consequences, and the next generation suffers those. Okay, let's pull back a bit. These chapters, 15 and 16. There's a few patterns as we're hovering over that come into view, right? Asa shows us that inherited patterns, they don't have to continue. He confronts idolatry even within his own family. And yes, like David, his choices aren't perfect. But his reign demonstrates that reform is possible. The northern kingdom, it just shows us the entire opposite movement, right? Jeroboam's compromise had then become tradition. So Baasha, he's the instrument of God. He removes Jeroboam's dynasty, but he just kept doing Jeroboam's way of things. Zimri, he grabbed power, he used violence, lost it in a week. Omri builds a politically important kingdom. The nations around know. But in doing that, he's still leading that nation further and further from Yahweh. And then Ahab, right? He just takes this accumulated drift. And those other generations have just set him up to turn it into official Baal worship. Different kings, different dynasties, right? But same underlying direction. So maybe the question that's running through these chapters isn't simply whether change is happening, because let's be honest, change is always happening. Kings, whoever they are constantly replacing one another. So maybe there's a more useful question. Is the change leading toward faithfulness? Or is it merely rearranging the same broken pattern? And I think that question can apply beyond ancient kingdoms, right? Let's bring it down, as my dad says, to us. Families inherit patterns. Communities, they inherit habits, right? Congregations they inherit assumptions. And sometimes we continue them just because we think they're good. We think they're life-giving. But I think at other times we continue them simply because no one stopped to ask us where they came from, or even what they're producing. And then occasionally someone like Asa, right, decides that an idol does not deserve protection merely because it's standing there for a long time. But that doesn't make reform easy. But it does remind us that inherited does not mean it's right or that it's inevitable. So maybe that's the question to carry from this part of the story. What have we inherited maybe that's worth preserving? What have we inherited that maybe needs to be examined? And are we actually changing direction? Are we, or are we just simply changing the names of the people and then heading along the same path? Those are questions that, well, I feel good to me. They're paths for dusty feet. So thanks for joining me tonight on the Dusty Feet. If this conversation's been useful, please subscribe, like, share it with someone who may want to walk this road alongside with us. But until next time, keep reading, right? Keep asking better questions. Keep looking for those connections, the context, the communities involved, and as always, Keep your feet dusty. Shalom, shalom.